The Atlantic never forgets. Somewhere in the deep water 400 miles west of the coast of France, a wreck still lies broken on the seabed. 15-inch guns pointed at nothing, her hull torn open along her spine. Once, not so long ago, she was the most feared warship in the world. Her name was Bismarck, and 3 days before she died, she had killed 1,400 British sailors in 8 minutes. 1,400 men, fathers, sons, boys of 18 and 19, gone in the time it takes to boil a kettle. Only 3 came home alive. Britain wanted revenge. The whole world was watching, and the ship that finally paid that debt was not the pride of the Royal Navy. Not the newest, not the fastest, not the one anyone would have picked. It was a 14-year-old battleship her own sailors called ugly. A ship crawling toward an American shipyard for repairs, half taken apart, with crates of spare parts on her deck and Bank of England gold in her hold. A ship the fleet had written off. Her name was HMS Rodney, and what she did on the morning of May 27, 1941, has never been done before and will never be done again. To understand how a ship called Obsolete ended up avenging the mightiest name in the Royal Navy, you have to go back almost 20 years to a room in Washington where the great powers of the world sat down and tried to prevent another war. The year was 1922. The First World War was 4 years gone, but its shadow was everywhere, millions dead, empires broken. Fleets rusting in harbours that could no longer afford them. Nobody wanted a new naval arms race. Nobody could pay for one. So the Americans, the British, the Japanese, the French and the Italians signed a treaty, and in that treaty they did something the world had never seen before. They put a leash on the battleship. No new capital ship could exceed 35,000 tons. No gun could be larger than 16 inches. The dream ships on British drawing boards, monsters bristling with guns and armour, died overnight. What the Royal Navy was allowed to build instead were 2 vessels squeezed inside these new limits. They named them Nelson and Rodney. The engineers who designed them faced a problem that had no clean answer. They wanted 16-inch guns, the heaviest the treaty allowed. They wanted armour thick enough to survive a modern shell. They wanted the range, the ammunition, the crew accommodations of a proper battleship. And they had to fit all of it inside 35,000 tons. Something had to be sacrificed. What was sacrificed was speed. And what was sacrificed was beauty. To save weight, the designers made a decision so radical it looked almost like a mistake. They took all 9 of the ship's main guns and shoved them forward of the bridge, 3 enormous triple turrets crammed together at the front of the ship. Nothing at the stern, nothing behind the funnel, just an empty deck, a stubby superstructure, and a single fat smokestack sitting far back like an afterthought. On paper, it was clever. It let them shorten the armoured section of the hull. It concentrated the protection where it mattered most. In the water, it looked wrong. She looked like a ship someone had built backwards, all teeth at one end, all body at the other. A great flat slab of steel that gave every officer who saw her the same silent thought, "This cannot be right." The fleet noticed. Fleet sailors always notice. They nicknamed her class the Cherry Trees, because like the tree in the American legend, they had been cut down by Washington. They called her Rodney, after the Royal Navy's oil tankers, because with that long flat foredeck and that single funnel, she looked less like a warship and more like a fleet auxiliary hauling fuel across the ocean. The Ugly Sisters, they called them, Nelson and Rodney. None of it was kind. And here is the twist that no one saw in 1925, that no one saw in 1930, that no one really saw until a grey morning in May 1941. The ugliness worked. Because those 3 cramped turrets carried 9 of the heaviest guns any battleship in the world was permitted to carry. Each shell weighed over 2,000 pounds, more than a ton of steel and high explosive. And when you added up the weight of a single Rodney broadside, everything her 9 guns could throw in one thunderous instant, and you compared it to what the newest German battleship could throw with her 8 lighter 15-inch guns. Rodney was heavier. By roughly 1/3, the ship the fleet mocked as a floating tanker carried the hardest punch of any battleship afloat. Nobody realized it yet. By May of 1941, Rodney was 14 years old, and she was tired. The relentless demands of 2 years of war had ground her machinery down. Her boilers were worn, her hull was leaking, her top speed on paper was 23 knots, and on a good day she could not quite reach it. In a fleet where new German and American and Japanese battleships were being built to steam at 30 knots, she was the slowest capital ship anyone still took seriously. She had earned her rest. The Admiralty had finally agreed. On the 22nd of May 1941, HMS Rodney sailed from the Clyde bound for Boston. The Boston Navy Yard was waiting for her. A full refit, new machinery, fresh guns, everything her aging body needed. Officially, the United States was neutral. Unofficially, American shipyards were quietly repairing British warships. It was another piece of a war America had not yet joined, but was already, in every quiet way that mattered, already fighting. She was not alone. She was escorting the passenger liner Britannic, no relation to the Titanic's sister ship lost in 1916. And her decks were a study in a ship that has been half taken apart. Here is the second twist. She was going to the shop, and she looked like it. Stacked along her decks in wooden crates were spare boiler tubes. New gun mountings still packed in grease, passengers, dockyard workers, even in her strong rooms a consignment of Bank of England gold bound for North America. She was not ready for battle. She was barely ready for a peaceful crossing. Her captain was Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton, 51 years old. A Scotsman, a quiet, careful officer from an old naval family, the kind of man who did not raise his voice and did not need to. He had inherited a tired ship on a tired errand, and his job that week was simple: get to Boston, keep the liner safe, hand the ship over to the Americans and let them make her new. 2 days out, on the evening of the 24th of May, he received a signal that changed everything. Somewhere far to the north, in the icy strait between Iceland and Greenland, the Royal Navy had met the enemy. And the enemy had won. To understand what that signal meant, you have to understand what had just died. For 20 years, the pride of the Royal Navy had a single name: HMS Hood, the mighty Hood, the largest warship in the world through most of the interwar years, sleek, fast, famous. Every British schoolboy knew her silhouette. She had circled the globe on show cruises in the 1920s. She was, more than any other ship, the symbol of British sea power. On the morning of the 24th of May, Hood met the newest, most modern battleship in the German fleet, the Bismarck. Bismarck was everything Rodney was not: modern, fast, beautifully engineered, excellent optics, excellent gunnery. She was accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and she carried the flag of Admiral Gunther Lütjens, who had just turned 52 2 days before, a man of dark moods and iron discipline. Hood carried the flag of Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, 53, a gunnery expert who had spent his career preparing for exactly this fight. The battle lasted about 8 minutes. Just before 6 in the morning, a salvo from Bismarck struck Hood near her main mast. What happened next has been argued over for 80 years, but the result is not in dispute. There was an explosion. A tower of flame reaching higher than the ship's superstructure. Hood, 48,000 tons of British steel and British history, broke in two. She sank in about 3 minutes. She carried a crew of over 1,400 men. 3 of them survived. 3. They were pulled the freezing sea Zeus later by the destroyer Electra. Their names were Ted Briggs, 18 years old, Bob Tilburn, 20, William Dundas, 18, and this is the third twist, the one that nobody planned. The 3 men who lived through the greatest naval disaster in British history were not admirals. They were not senior officers. They were not the ones the Navy would have chosen to survive. They were 3 young sailors, teenagers and near teenagers, who happened to be standing in exactly the right place when the explosion tore their world apart. Everyone else on that ship, including the Admiral, was gone. Britain was stunned, the pride of the fleet, the mightiest ship. The name every child knew, destroyed in the time it takes to read this paragraph. From London came an order that would consume the entire home fleet. Find her, sink her, whatever it takes. Sink the Bismarck. Warships were flung into the hunt from every direction. 6 battleships and battlecruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, more than 40 warships turning across the Atlantic to corner one enemy. Somewhere north of Iceland, the tired old cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, commanded from Norfolk by Rear Admiral Frederick Wakewalker, 52 years old, were still shadowing Bismarck through the murk, hanging on to a radar contact that might slip away at any moment. And out in the middle of the Atlantic, 400 miles from the fight, a signal reached the bridge of HMS Rodney. Dalrymple Hamilton read it, then he read it again. Bismarck was loose. The home fleet needed every heavy gun it could find. He was ordered to leave the liner Britannic and turn east. He did not wait for the signal to be repeated. He did not wait for a second confirmation. He turned his tired, half-disassembled battleship into the rising wind and set a course toward a battle he had never been meant to fight. Below decks, engineers looked at each other. The boilers were not supposed to be pushed. The hull was not supposed to be strained. There were crates on the deck, and workmen in the passageways and gold in the strong room, and a passenger liner falling astern into the dark. None of it mattered now. Somewhere ahead out in the grey Atlantic was the ship that had killed Hood, and the tired old battleship that everyone had written off was turning east to find her. The Atlantic in late May of 1941 was not a place. It was a mood, grey water, grey sky, a cold wind that never fully stopped. Waves that ran 20 feet high and threw green water clean over the forecastle of any ship foolish enough to push into them. Somewhere in that vast, empty ocean a killer was running, and every warship the Royal Navy could scrape together was trying to find her before she disappeared. On the bridge of HMS Rodney, Captain Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton did the arithmetic of a man in trouble. Bismarck was fast. Bismarck was hurt, but she was fast. Her design speed was over 30 knots. On a good day, in a calm sea, she could sprint away from almost any battleship in the world. Rodney could not make 22. The captain understood what that meant. Every hour Bismarck steamed at full speed, she gained 9 miles on Rodney. Every hour. If the German ship stayed healthy, if she kept her rudders and her boilers and her nerve, Rodney would never see her. Rodney would arrive at the scene of a battle already lost, the way a doctor arrives at a house where the patient has already died. The only chance she had was for something to slow Bismarck down, and so Dalrymple Hamilton did the only thing he could do. He pushed his tired ship. He pushed her harder than she had been pushed in years. The fourth twist began in her boiler rooms. Below the armoured deck, in spaces that had never been meant for prolonged full power, the stokers and engineers were fighting their own war. According to the men who lived through it, the temperature in one boiler room climbed to around 124 degrees Fahrenheit. 51 degrees Celsius. It is a number so brutal that a modern industrial safety inspector would shut a factory down for exposing workers to it for 10 minutes. Rodney's engineers stood in it for hours. They wore rags soaked in water tied around their heads. They took shifts of a few minutes at a time because a full watch was impossible. They tended boilers whose linings were cracked, whose tubes were worn, whose gauges climbed into red zones no engineer wanted to see. They kept her steaming. Up on deck in the driving spray, other men were doing something almost as strange. They were throwing the future overboard. Those crates of spare parts, those boiler tubes bound for the Boston shipyard, the new fittings still packed in grease. Anything that was loose, anything the sea could pick up and hurl into a superstructure at 40 knots of relative wind. It went over the side, or it was lashed down with wire, or it was manhandled below into any compartment that would hold it. The deck of a battleship going to war is not a deck stacked with cargo, so the cargo went, the gold stayed. There was no way to move that, and somewhere on the horizon, invisible, unreachable, Bismarck was slipping away. For 31 hours she vanished. This is a piece of the story that is hard to feel now, in an age of satellites and GPS. But in May of 1941, the Atlantic was still large enough to swallow a battleship. Bismarck had shaken off the shadowing cruisers in the early hours of the 25th. And then silence, no radar, no sighting, nothing. On the flagship King George V, Admiral John Tovey, 56 years old, a small, precise, deeply religious man, faced a nightmare. He had no idea where his enemy was. He had lost her, and every hour she was lost, she was closer to the umbrella of German air cover off the French coast, where U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers would make any British approach suicidal. On Rodney, Dalrymple Hamilton listened to the wireless traffic and heard the sound of a hunt going cold. Then Bismarck made a mistake. Admiral Lütjens on the German bridge believed his ship was still being tracked. She was not, but he did not know that. And so, on the morning of the 25th of May, he sent a long radio message home to Germany, a message about the battle in the Denmark Strait, about the sinking of Hood, about his intentions. British radio direction finders across the North Atlantic caught the transmission. They plotted the bearings, they drew the lines, and they gave the Admiralty a rough position for a ship that had, until that moment, been a ghost. It was not enough on its own, but it was a beginning, and then, on the morning of the 26th of May, a Catalina flying boat came out of the clouds 10 miles from Bismarck, and the whole hunt turned on its axis. Here is the fifth twist, and it is one of the strangest facts of the entire Second World War. The Catalina was British. She flew for Coastal Command out of Lough Erne in Northern Ireland. She wore Royal Air Force roundels on her wings. But sitting in the co-pilot's seat, hands on the controls of an American-built aircraft flying for the British against the Jersons, was a young man named Leonard B. Smith. He was an ensign in the United States Navy. The United States of America, in May of 1941, was not at war. She was neutral. Pearl Harbor was 6 months away. American servicemen were not officially supposed to be flying combat patrols over the Atlantic looking for German warships. But they were. There was a quiet, unofficial exchange program between the US Navy and the Royal Air Force. American pilots, experienced with the Catalina, were sent to Britain to help teach the aircraft to British crews. They flew missions. They saw combat. It was a violation of American neutrality that both governments preferred not to talk about, and on the morning of the 26th of May, one of those American pilots was at the controls when a great grey shape appeared through a break in the clouds. Ensign Smith looked down at the ship. He circled cautiously. He identified her, Bismarck. The signal that went out from the Catalina rewrote the war. 6 months before Pearl Harbor, before America was officially anyone's ally, an American Navy pilot had put Britain's most hunted enemy back on the map. And now the hunt had a target again, but there was still a problem, a terrible problem. Bismarck was found. But nothing that could sink her was close enough to catch her. Nothing except one thing, one old, fragile, almost absurd thing. Fairy Swordfish torpedo bombers flying off the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. You have to see these aircraft to understand what came next. The Swordfish was a biplane. In 1941, a fabric-covered, open cockpit three-man aircraft with a top speed of around 90 knots. It looked like something out of the First World War. Pilots called it the string bag because, like an old lady's shopping bag, it could carry almost anything. It flew low, it flew slow, and in the imagination of anyone who saw it, it had no business near a modern battleship. On the afternoon of the 26th of May, in a full Atlantic gale, 15 Swordfish took off from Ark Royal's pitching deck. The wind over the deck was so strong that the aircraft were nearly stationary at the moment of launch, held in the air by the storm itself. They flew out to find Bismarck. They found her. The attack was chaos, anti-aircraft fire everywhere, wind tearing at the fabric wings. Pilots trying to line up torpedo runs on a ship that was throwing up shell splashes the size of houses. Most of the torpedoes missed. Some ran wide, some ran deep and passed harmlessly under the target, one did not. One Swordfish, at low level, put a torpedo into the sea that ran true and struck Bismarck near her stern. It exploded against her rudders. This is the sixth twist, and it is not what history sometimes says it is. For decades, a British pilot named John Moffat was credited with dropping the torpedo that jammed Bismarck's rudder. Moffat himself claimed it late in life. It became one of the war's famous stories. The historical reality is more honest and less satisfying. The records from that day do not clearly identify which Swordfish put its torpedo into the stern. Several pilots dropped in the same attack window. Several attacked from angles that could have produced the hit. The men who could have known are almost all gone, and their memories, taken years apart, contradict each other. What we know for certain is the result. The torpedo detonated in almost the only spot on Bismarck's hull where it could cripple her. It wrecked her steering compartment, it jammed her rudders in a hard turn to port, and it left the fastest battleship in the world unable to steer anything but a slow, helpless circle to the north. North was exactly the direction from which the British were coming. On Bismarck's bridge, Admiral Schützens understood what had happened before the damage control reports came back. He signalled Berlin with a message that has been quoted ever since: "Ship unmaneuverable, we will fight to the last shell." That evening, in the wardrooms and the crew quarters of the German battleship, they read the messages that came back from home. From Hitler, from Grand Admiral Raeder, from naval headquarters. Lutyens, according to the survivors who lived to talk about it, made a speech to the crew. It was not a speech of hope. It was a speech about honor, about dying well, about the fatherland. His captain, Ernst Lindemann, 47 years old, a professional officer respected by his men, is remembered as being furious. Lindemann had not given up. Lindemann believed there was still time. There was still a chance. Perhaps Luftwaffe bombers would reach them at dawn. Perhaps U-boats would break the pursuit. He is remembered as saying, in effect, that the crew did not need to be told to die. They needed to be told to fight. The two men, Lutyens and Lindemann, had disagreed for days about the mission, about the return route, about whether to go into port for repairs after Denmark Strait. Now, in the last night of both their lives, they disagreed about how to face what was coming. Neither would live to see the argument settled. That night on Bismarck was a night of small mercies and small horrors. Men wrote letters they would never send. Men drank cognac from the officers' mess. Some slept, some prayed, some sat by their guns in the wet dark and waited. And around them, in the black wind, the destroyers came. 5 destroyers, 4 British and 1 Polish. The Polish ship was the ORP Piorun, and her captain was Commander Eugeniusz Pawski, 46 years old. Pawski had watched his country crushed by the German army in 1939. He had escaped. His crew were exiles. Poland was under occupation. Warsaw was in German hands. Every man on that destroyer had lost something. Piorun sighted Bismarck first in the last light of the 26th of May. Pawski did what almost no destroyer captain does in the face of a battleship. He charged. He put his tiny ship, less than 2,000 tons, on a course toward the largest and most powerful surface of warship in the German fleet. And as he closed, he ordered his signal lamp to flash a message across the water. 4 words, "I am a Pole." There is no evidence Bismarck ever answered. Her guns did. Great 15-inch shells fell around Piorun, throwing up water taller than her masts. Pawski held his course for over an hour before finally breaking off. He did not put a torpedo into her. He probably could not have, but he had said something the war remembered. "I am a Pole." Through the night, the 4 British destroyers under Captain Philip Vian, 46, a hard, aggressive officer who would later become one of the Royal Navy's most famous fighters, kept up the attack. They fired torpedoes in the dark. They fired star shells to keep Bismarck lit. They pulled away and came back and pulled away again. They did not sink her. They probably did not even hit her. But they kept her awake. They kept her exhausted. They kept her fixed in place. By dawn, Bismarck's crew had not slept for days, and behind them, coming up out of the west, the heavy ships of the home fleet were finally in range. On Rodney, in the dark hours before the 27th of May, Dalrymple Hamilton spoke to his ship's company. He told them what they were about to do. He told them who they were about to fight. The men who wrote about that moment later remembered the silence. Rodney's crew was not a crew of green sailors. Many of them had been at sea for years. Many of them had friends on other ships. And many of them, when the captain said the word hood, went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. The debt was personal. Everyone on Rodney knew somebody, or knew somebody who knew somebody. Below decks, gun crews were nursing the last of Rodney's armor-piercing shells into the hoists. The gunnery officers were running through firing solutions. The engineers were coaxing another hour, another half hour, out of boilers that should have been condemned months ago. Up on the flagship King George V, Admiral Tovey faced the 7th twist, and this one was the cruelest of all. He was running out of fuel. The chase across the Atlantic had drained his tanks. His destroyers had already been sent home, one by one, as they hit their bingo point. Now King George V herself was down to the last hundreds of tons. Rodney was in the same trouble. If the battle did not start soon and did not end quickly, Tovey would have to break off and turn for home with Bismarck still afloat. He set himself a deadline. If the enemy could not be finished by early afternoon, he would have to withdraw the battleships and leave the cruisers to try to sink her with torpedoes alone. It would be the end of the great gun duel he had wanted. It would take from the Royal Navy the moment they had crossed an ocean to have. Hood would be avenged, if she was avenged at all, by torpedoes fired in the murk by lighter ships. It would not be the same. Bismarck, on the other side of the horizon, did not know any of this. She did not know how thin Tovey's fuel was. She did not know how close he was to being forced to turn away. She did not know that her greatest weapon, in those last hours before dawn, was simply time. That if she could hold out through the morning, the British would have to leave her. She could not know, because she could not steer. She could no longer choose to run, she could only wait, and in the last hour of darkness on the 27th of May 1941, from three sides of the compass, the ships that had crossed an ocean for one purpose closed in on her. The sky in the east began to grey, the sea rose, the wind rose, and out of the murk on Bismarck's port bow, two great shapes came on through the spray, holding their fire, coming steady, coming close. The senior surviving gunnery officer on Bismarck, Lieutenant Commander Burkhard von Müllenheim-Reschberg, 30 years old, watched them come. Years later, when he wrote his memoir, he described that moment in words that have never lost their weight. They advanced, he wrote, as imperturbably as though they were on their way to an execution. He was right about the execution. He was wrong about whose it would be. 8:47 in the morning, the 27th of May 1941. The sea was heavy. The sky was low, a cold wind was blowing out of the northwest, and the light was the colour of wet iron. On the bridge of HMS Rodney, Captain Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton lifted his glasses one last time, looked at the great grey silhouette on his starboard bow, and gave the order that 1,400 dead men on Hood had been waiting for. Open fire. 9 16-inch guns turned in 3 enormous turrets crammed together at the bow of the ship. Together they weighed more than most destroyers. Together they could throw more than 9 tons of steel and high explosive across 23,000 yards of ocean in a single instant. They fired. The concussion was not a sound, it was a physical event. Windows on Rodney's bridge blew inward, loose gear on her deck was hurled sideways. In the messes below, plates that had survived 14 years at sea shattered on the deck. Every man aboard felt his organs move inside him. 9 great fingers of black smoke reached across the water toward Bismarck, and Bismarck fired back. This is the part of the story that is sometimes forgotten. Bismarck was not a helpless target in those first minutes. Her fire control was superb. Her gunnery officers were among the best trained in any navy. Her second salvo straddled Rodney, and the third came close enough to throw green water across her decks. For the first stretch of the battle, nearly 20 minutes of it, the German battleship shot the way she had shot in the Denmark Strait, the way she had shot when she killed Hood. And then, at about 9 minutes past 9 in the morning, a heavy shell came down out of the grey sky and struck Bismarck's forward superstructure. The historical record does not tell us for certain whose shell it was. It might have been Rodney, it might have been King George V, coming in from a different bearing under Admiral John Tovey. British sources have argued about it for 80 years. The German survivors could not know, because most of the men who might have known were already dead. What we know is what the shell did. It smashed into the area around Bismarck's forward command position. In that space, or in the compartments immediately below it, Admiral Gunther Lütjens almost certainly died. Captain Ernst Lindemann almost certainly died. Every senior officer who had been directing the battle from the bridge was killed in a single terrible instant. The most powerful battleship in the German fleet had, in a matter of minutes, been decapitated, command passed downward through the chain of officers. It fell, eventually, to Lieutenant Commander Burkhard von Müllenheim-Reschberg in the after fire control station at the stern, 30 years old. A junior gunnery officer who had woken up that morning as a subordinate on a great ship. He was now the senior officer, alive on a great ship that was being killed. He gave the orders he could. He aimed his after-turrets at King George V. He fired the salvos he could still fire. And then a British shell smashed his station too, and his rangefinders went dark, and the last coherent gunnery on Bismarck effectively ended. Around him, above him, below him, the ship was coming apart. The forward turrets, Anton and Bruno, were knocked out over the next 20 minutes. A 16-inch shell from Rodney is believed to have struck the face of Anton and blown out the rear of the turret. Bruno went silent not long after. The men inside those turrets, in their armoured steel now peeled open like a can, did not survive. And now Dalrymple Hamilton did the thing that battleship captains almost never do. He closed, he gave orders that took Rodney closer and then closer again to a burning enemy. not the ranges of a modern gunnery duel, 20,000 yards, 15,010. He took her inside all of them. Rodney's rangefinders, at one point in the last part of the battle, were reading a range of about 2,700 yards. 2,700 yards, under a mile and a half, point-blank range in a battleship fight, a distance so short that Rodney's great guns were firing almost flat on a nearly horizontal trajectory, hurling one-ton shells across the water like a rifle firing across a field. Almost every shot hit. There has never been a duel like it in the history of modern battleships. There will never be one again. Rodney was hurting herself, firing her forward guns at such extreme angles so close aboard the enemy the blast of her own broadsides was tearing into her own structure. The concussion cracked plating on her decks, it shattered fittings in her superstructure, it ruptured pipes, it broke plumbing. According to Rodney's own damage reports, one of the most curious details of the entire battle is that the most serious damage suffered by HMS Rodney that morning was inflicted by the recoil and muzzle blast of her own 16-inch guns. Bismarck barely scratched her. The treaty compromise, the discarded design, the ship the naval press had dismissed for 15 years, was breaking the newest battleship in the German fleet, and the only thing hurting her was the violence of her own reply. There is a story from this part of the battle that has never been fully settled. Rodney still carried those two enormous torpedo tubes, 24.5 inches across, the largest ever fitted to any capital ship in history. At some point during the action, at close range, she fired her torpedoes at Bismarck. Rodney's own officers later claimed that at least one of them hit. If that claim is true, it is the only occasion in all of naval history in which one battleship has struck another battleship with a torpedo. The claim has never been settled. Von Müllenheim-Rechberg, the senior German survivor, did not believe it. The wrecks of both ships have been surveyed on the seabed by Robert Ballard in 1989 and by James Cameron in 2002, and neither expedition found clear evidence of a torpedo strike on Bismarck's hull. The British historian Ludovic Kennedy, in his classic book on the pursuit, treated the claim with polite skepticism. The truth is probably this. Rodney's crew believed they had made history. They may have. They may not have. The evidence is not there, and the men who fired the torpedoes and the men who might have been struck by them are almost all gone. Take it as what it is, a proud claim, honestly made, never fully proven. The gunfire is not in dispute. By 9:30 in the morning, Bismarck's main battery had fired her last salvo. Her guns were dead. Her upper works were an inferno. Fires burned along her length. Smoke rolled in black columns into the low Atlantic sky. She would not sink. This is what makes the last hour of the battle so hard to describe. Because Bismarck's builders, whatever else they had done, had built her stability into her bones. She had watertight compartments so cleverly designed that even torn open by dozens of heavy shells, she refused to roll over. She refused to go down. Rodney and King George V, having ceased to be attacked, now became executioners. They stood off. They fired again. Slow, deliberate, methodical salvos into a burning wreck that would not die. 16-inch shells, 14-inch shells. 6-inch secondary batteries. The two British battleships poured metal into the German ship the way you'd pour water on a fire that refused to go out. By the end, Rodney had fired roughly 380 16-inch shells and over 700 more from her 6-inch guns in a single morning of work. Aboard Rodney, some of the men who had cheered the first salvo were not cheering now. There is a strange truth about revenge. It is one thing to want it, it is a different thing to watch it. Below decks on Bismarck, the horror was total. Fires everywhere, water rising in some compartments, trapped men in others. The last coherent orders, according to the survivors, were to scuttle the ship. Explosive charges in the engineering spaces. Seacocks opened, whatever hastened the end. Around 10:10 in the morning, Admiral Tovey looked at his fuel gauges. He looked at the ship still burning across the water. He gave the order that no admiral in that position ever wanted to give. Cease fire. His battleships had done what they had come to do. Now they had to save themselves. King George V and Rodney turned away, low in the water with fuel exhaustion, and steamed north toward home. The finishing was left to a cruiser, HMS Dorsetshire, which closed and fired torpedoes into Bismarck's port and starboard sides. At about 10:39 in the morning on the 27th of May 1941, Bismarck rolled over onto her port side and sank stern first into the grey Atlantic. The question of what finally killed her has never been fully answered. Ballard's expedition in 1989 found her hull relatively intact and argued for scuttling. The British investigator David Mearns, working with wreck footage in 2001, found evidence of shell damage below the waterline and argued that Allied fire had also opened her hull. The likeliest truth is that all three killed her: the guns, the torpedoes, the scuttling charges. She died from all of them together. Of her crew of over 2,000 men, 114 survived, and here is one of the ugliest facts of the whole story. The rescue was not enough. Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori pulled sailors out of the freezing water for less than an hour before a submarine alarm sounded. There may have been a U-boat, there may not have been, but the risk was too great and both ships got underway and left. Hundreds of German sailors were still in the water when the British ships pulled away. Most of them died there. It is a decision that has been argued about ever since. There is no clean answer to it. There is only the ocean and the men who did not come home. Somewhere among the ships circling the sinking, on the deck of the Polish destroyer Pierun, a young officer named Erich Sopoćko watched Bismarck go down. He was 27 years old. His country was under German occupation. His family was somewhere in a Poland he could not reach. He is the man who wrote later the words that came to be associated with that morning: "Justice, you still exist." He did not survive the war. He was killed on the 16th of June 1942 when the Polish destroyer OOP Kujawiak struck a mine off the coast of Malta. He was 28 years old, but the sentence outlived him. Justice, you still exist. The ships turned for home. Rodney's part in the war was not over. She would go on to serve through the Mediterranean campaigns, through the invasion of Normandy, where her 16-inch guns would fire in support of Allied troops on the beaches. She would finish the war worn down almost to the point of collapse, her machinery finally beyond repair. In 1948, 3 years after the peace, she was towed to the breakers at Inverkeithing in Scotland and cut up for scrap. There was no ceremony, there was no memorial. The ship that had avenged Hood ended in a shipyard, sold by weight, taken apart by men with cutting torches. The 3 Hood survivors lived on. Ted Briggs, 18 years old on the day his ship broke in two, went home. He served in the Royal Navy for another 32 years. He spoke when he could bear to about what he had seen. He founded the HMS Hood Association. He carried Hood's story into old age. He died on the 4th of October 2008 at the age of 85, the last living survivor of the mighty Hood. Bob Tilburn died in 1995. William Dundas, who had climbed out of a hatch as the ship rolled, was killed in a car crash in 1965. He was 42. On the German side, Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg, the young lieutenant commander who had taken command of Bismarck in her last minutes, survived the sinking. He was pulled from the water by Dorsetshire before the U-boat alarm. He was taken prisoner. He lived. He wrote a book called Battleship Bismarck, a survivor's story. He died on the 18th of June 2003 at the age of 92, and this is perhaps the last twist of all. Ted Briggs and Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg met more than once in the years after the war, at ceremonies, at reunions. At the small, quiet gatherings where old sailors of enemy navies remember old dead friends. 2 men who had been on opposite sides of the greatest surface battle of the Atlantic War. 2 men whose ships had killed each other's shipmates. They shook hands. They spoke as men, not as enemies. They understood something that only survivors ever really understand. The critics of 1925 had looked at HMS Rodney and called her obsolete. They had called her ugly. They had said she was slow, awkward, a treaty compromise, a relic of a lost design philosophy, a floating tanker with a bad haircut. They had measured her by the standards of a peaceful drawing board and found her wanting. And on a grey morning in May of 1941, 400 miles west of the coast of France, that tired old battleship had crossed 1,000 miles of storm, closed to point-blank range with the pride of the German fleet, and torn it apart with the heaviest broadside any battleship in the world was permitted to carry. The Atlantic covered the wreck. The war went on. The old ship went back to work. But somewhere in the deep water, 400 miles west of the coast of France, a debt written in the blood of 1,400 men had been paid in full. And the ship that paid it was the one nobody thought could.